Hello everyone, and welcome to the screencast video for chapter 3. I just want to remind you, I'm going to click over here to the learning page for chapter 3. Just want to remind you that these screencasts are intended for a quick overview of the presentation itself. So we use the presentation as the backdrop, and I try and highlight the most important things that you study and read from the chapter. Make sure that you do all 5 of these steps. Okay, here we go. So the introduction in chapter 3 is about the cell. The cell is the most important unit of life on the planet. Every form of life is composed of cells. Then we're going to talk about cell structure, we're going to talk about cell transport, and homeostasis. Think of homeostasis as the word which means how a cell stays stable. Make sure you go over the lesson objectives. Make sure you become familiar with the vocabulary that we use. I'll be using that vocabulary as we go through this. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the cell theory. There were 2 scientists by the name of Schwann and Schleiden that in the 1800s said, wow, we think that all life on this planet is made of cells, and they came up with the cell theory. Here are the 3 basic components of the cell theory. All organisms are made of 1 or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of life in all living things, and all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. So for example, you started out as 1 cell, then 2, then 4, then 8, and 9 months later, we have you. One of the things you have to keep in mind about cells is that they are very, very small. They can't get big, and one of the things you'll read about is why cells can't get big. And make sure you know that and understand that one of the reasons cells are so small is materials have to get in and out of the cell very, very quickly. Cells come in a variety of shapes. Here we have a nerve cell, here we have red blood cells, bacteria, algae. The parts of the cell. One of the things I want to point out is that your textbook uses the terms plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is also called the cell membrane. Most of the materials, the animations that you'll see in this chapter refer to it as the cell membrane. Make sure you know what the cytoplasm, what ribosomes do, and what DNA does. We'll talk about all of those in more detail in the course. There are 2 types of cells. Generally speaking, there's prokaryotic cells, which are smaller, don't have a nucleus. They do have DNA in them, but they're very much bacteria-like. And then the cells that you're made of are called eukaryotic cells. They do have a nucleus. I mentioned that cells are really small. Think of a millimeter. A millimeter is very, very tiny measurement on a meter stick. Even a millimeter is way too big to measure cells with. So we take 1 millimeter and we divide it by 1,000 parts, and that's called a micron. That's a new scale that I'd like you to be familiar with. And what we have here is 1 millimeter equals 1,000 microns. But let's go down. 1 micron is a bacteria cell. So bacteria range anywhere from 1 micron to 10 microns large. You'll also hear the term micron used as micrometers, that those 2 terms are synonymous. To give you a sense of size, in the presentation we are linked to this interactive. I'm going to tab over here to this live interaction. I'd like you to take a look at it. Here, up here, it says 1 millimeter. If 1 millimeter is this is the size of a coffee bean, a grain of rice, a sesame seed. But watch what happens as we move the slider down. Notice what happens to the scale over here, and as we zoom in more and more and more, now we're down to a grain of salt, which they have as about 1/2 of a millimeter. But now when things get even smaller, we can't use millimeters anymore. We have to use what are called microns. So here's a amoeba, which is a large cell. It's 500 microns, so it's 1/2 of a millimeter. 500 microns, let's zoom down even more. We get to a paramecium, which are in length about 210 microns, a skin cell, 30 microns, and we zoom in further and further and further. Here's a red blood cells at 8 microns. Pretty soon we're getting down to the size of bacteria and even to the size of viruses. You'll notice that bacteria are about 3 microns. This is about 3 microns from here to here, and about 1/2 of a micron, 0.6 of a micron from the width. But once we get down to viral size, and we talk about viruses later on in the chapter, we need another scale called taking 1 micron, dividing that by 1,000, and those are called nanometers. So you could scroll down even more. This is linked in your presentation. You'll be able to use this. In section 3.2, they're going to talk about the functions of the cell membrane, the plasma membrane. Make sure you read over the lesson objectives, become familiar with them, and the vocabulary. If you take a look at this vocabulary, it starts with a molecule called ATP. ATP is like the gasoline of every cell. It's the energy source. Where does that come from? It's made from us ripping apart glucose that we get from plants. We'll talk all about that later on. Here is the periodic table. Why do we have a picture of the periodic table when we're talking about cells? Well, every form of matter on the planet is either one or a combination of these elements. Well, we're matter. Life is matter. And the 4 major elements that make up all of life are circled in red here: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So the 4 elements that make up all life are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. But remember, those then come together to make the 4 main types of molecules. And the 4 main types of molecules in living things are proteins. Think of proteins as the workhorse molecules of your cells. Carbohydrates, that's what gives us the energy in our cells. Lipids, that's how we store our energy. And the information to make cells and carry out processes is stored in the DNA and the RNA, the information storing molecules. So here's a picture from your textbook. Here is the cell membrane, or the plasma membrane as your textbook calls it. The cell membrane, this would be right here is outside the cell, this would be inside the cell, and this is referred to as a phospholipid bilayer. Here are the elements that make up this. And take a look at this. Notice that you have lots of hydrogen, lots of carbon, lots of oxygen, lots of nitrogen in there. So as we said, the 4 main elements that these molecules are made up of: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Here's a close-up of one of the molecules that's down here. So this is the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, sometimes also called the phospholipid bilayer. But take a look at this. Here's another picture of the phospholipid bilayer. Notice that there are things that float in it. In the animation we're going to ask you to watch later on, you'll learn that these are proteins, and these proteins help things get in and out of the cell. Very, very important. Here's a typical animal cell, very stylized. The main parts that I'd like you to know at this point are what the ribosome, what the nucleus, what the lysosome, and what the mitochondria do. Here is a typical plant cell, and we'd like you to look over and read this section, but especially what chloroplasts do. In your textbook on page 63, we start talking about the nucleus and other organelles. And the nucleus is the largest organelle in most eukaryotic cells. It's considered the cell control center. Make sure you read carefully about that. Mitochondria is a part of the cell that supplies energy to all of your cells. Very, very important. We mentioned that glucose is turned into an energy-rich molecule called ATP. We'll talk about that a lot in the course. So make sure you read about the mitochondria. This is a screenshot from the animation that we'd like you to watch about cell membranes. And so click out to that, make sure you read it, take notes. A couple of questions might be on the quiz from that. This is a wonderful, sophisticated science animation about what the cell membrane is. Now we'd like to look at how cells are organized in different creatures, different organisms. So the first is you do have organisms on our planet which are just one cell. Very, very tiny organisms. These would live usually in creeks and ponds and lakes, in the ocean. The ocean has lots of single-celled organisms. This picture here is a single-celled organism called Blepharisma. So that means it does all the life functions just with one cell. But then as life changed, we also have living things that live in colonies. So here's a colony of an organism called Volvox, and every dot you see there is exactly the same type of cell. The cells are not what is called differentiated. They don't do their own thing, their own function. So each of those, they've just formed together as a colony. As we move to a more higher level cell organization. In this case, this is a picture of sponges, and sponges have the ability for some of their cells to do specific functions. For example, some cells digest food. That's not true in the more primitive structures. An organism like the jellyfish has tissue-level organization, and what that means is the cells that do the same function group together in similar tissue. Tissue just means a collection of the same type of cell, and in this case, some tissues in a jellyfish will digest food. Roundworms have organ-level organization. That's what we have. We have organ-level organization, and let's look at this diagram. So our organs like the esophagus or the stomach or the liver or the gallbladder all do a specific function for us. The last section in the chapter is called cell transport and homeostasis. The important thing to keep in mind here is the use of energy to move things in and out of the cell. Either the cell uses energy or it does not. The term homeostasis, some of you may have heard it but forgotten what it is. Homeostasis means how does a cell maintain stability? So there are a couple things, couple ways I should say, that cells get materials in and out. One is called passive transport. And with passive transport, no energy is used by the cell. Let's take a look at this. If here's the cell membrane right across the middle, and we concentrate some material outside the cell, that's what extracellular space means. Over time, some of that material will diffuse into the cell, and it will stop when the concentration is same on the outside and the inside. And the cell doesn't use any of its energy to do that. That just happens because of what's called a concentration gradient, where the different concentrations on the inside and the outside. There's another type of diffusion called facilitated diffusion, and think of the word facilitated as just help. These are proteins that are embedded into the cell membrane, and they help materials either move in or move out of the cell. Again, no energy is used. Then we have active transport, and that's when the cell does use energy across the membrane. One example of active transport is called the sodium-potassium pump, and in this pump, the free sodium ions bind. What I'd like you to do is read through this. I won't ask you any real specific questions on this. Most of the questions on the quiz will be conceptual. Just keep in mind that different kinds of animal cells are wildly different shape. Like look at the nerve cell in the center here. This is to send signals up and down. The muscle cell is to contract. The red blood cell's purpose is to take oxygen to every cell in the body. So lots of different shapes, lots of different sizes, and that have to do with the function of how it works. One term that we'd like you to know at this point is something called stem cells. You may have heard of these. But first I want to show you a little picture. This is a picture of a type of fly called a fruit fly. These guys are pretty small. Sometimes you'll see them around bananas that have been sitting out too long. And for a long time, scientists studied fruit flies to see how animals developed from one cell to a full organism. These days, we don't use fruit flies, we use zebrafish, and zebrafish here are vertebrates, and that's what we use to take a look at how we've developed. What I'd like you to do is watch this zebrafish embryo development and take a look at that as we go from one cell to 2 to 4. I think you'll find this really interesting. Right here is the link to that in the presentation. Make sure you link it and watch that. And then this is a screenshot from the stem cell animation that I'd like you to take a look at. Please watch this, and we may have a question or two in the quiz about it. So remember, this was just an overview, a quick overview. We'll have weekly meetings where we can discuss if you have any questions, and good luck studying for Chapter 3.